the medical center director contacted our 24/7 duty phone number and indicated that the facility had reviewed multiple instances going back to January of 2018 and had identified inpatients who had suffered severe low blood sugar, all of which, with the exception of one, had passed away shortly thereafter.
The victims in this case were all elderly males. They all had various health conditions. However, the clinical expectation was that they were all supposed to be discharged. Death did not appear to be imminent.
Some of the medical doctors found it unusual, first of all, that there were multiple non-diabetic patients that were dying of these severely low blood sugars.
There was no logical reason why their blood sugar plummeted to such dangerously low levels.
We didn't really know what we were looking at. Did we have a bad actor or multiple bad actors at play here? And in what capacity? Were they employees? Were they civilians? Were they fellow veterans or fellow inpatients? Or were there some sort of rational explanations from a medical perspective?
In less than 24 hours, there was a team of agents from literally all over the country converging on Clarksburg to launch the investigation.
Within a day of opening their investigation, they contacted the local FBI office, and we got involved.
These veteran inpatients not only suffered these instances of severe low blood sugar, but when the countermeasure medication was administered, they basically went into spikes of peaks and valleys because the blood sugar could not normalize.
That was the major tipping point. It shows that someone might have actually killed someone by administering insulin. Either someone was accidentally doing this or they were doing it on purpose.
We also learned all of these patients were in an inpatient setting, all on the same ward, Ward 3A. We were on the clock at that point, and we really took it upon ourselves. We did not want something bad happening or another death on our hands.
Losing Archie was really hard. He was really kind-hearted and just really generous. I just didn't understand.
He wanted to go home. Dad says, you know, don't leave me here, take me home. And I didn't do it, I left him there. That was a lot of guilt over that until he died.
He always loved the military. He loved the lifestyle. He told us that if anything happened to him, where he wanted to be was the VA. He got to feeling better.
He was talking and everything. I mean,
Yeah.
He was doing really good.
We go in there and they told us that the sugar had bottomed out. Dad wasn't a diabetic, so it's like, okay, why is the sugar bottoming out? I didn't think that somebody had actually done something to him or anything. I thought it was just Dad's time, you know.
George was a wonderful husband, a wonderful father. So he was being treated for his congestive heart failure. He was supposed to come home on Monday.
His levels dropped. They plummeted. And I said, something's not right. He's not a diabetic. No. Why would his sugar drop that low?
Hypoglycemic.
I said, Daddy, it's okay. It's okay. You go see your mom and dad now. But it was my father, and he was suffering.
We did not have a suspect, and we really had a broad scope of what we were trying to look at here. We more or less kicked it into high gear 24/7 around the clock.
We interviewed all of the employees that worked on 3A and also the physicians that had treated the victims. And through time cards, work schedules, and other records, that helped narrow down the possible list of subjects or suspects that could be involved in the case.
It quickly became apparent there were a total of 4 individuals at the hospital out of 1,200 employees who were there at each of the dates for these events.
Rita Mays was an uncertified nursing assistant who worked in the medical surgical unit they referred to as Ward 3A. She was responsible for taking the vitals of patients, intake and outtake, as well as taking glucometer or finger stick readings of blood sugar levels of patients.
It is 8:17 p.m. Special Agent Earl Gilliam here with Miss
Rita Mays.
What's your title?
I'm a nurse's aide.
In the initial interview, you really just want her to do as much talking as possible so then go back later and impeach the information that she gave us.
Our team was directly across the hall to just listen in. We were putting the pieces together to see what we could make of what she had to say.
You ever administer insulin to patients?
No.
Not at all?
No. Aides are not to give any type of meds.
And what about the med room? Do you go to the med room where they keep the medications?
The only time that I've gone in there is when I've been with a nurse.
She denied being in the medication room alone, which we knew was contradictory with what witnesses told us previously. And what's important there is that the insulin was stored in the medication room.
Some of Rita Mays' coworkers on 3A had various accounts that stuck out to us as far as red flags. She more or less did not act normal when compared to the rest of her coworkers. There were some instances where she held patients' hands while crying bedside with them as well too, which a lot of the staff indicated to us was abnormal.
But anybody ever question you about anything as far as being in the patient's room in any form or fashion?
Mm-mm.
I'm happy to ask these questions. You are exhibiting the demeanor of a person that's not being totally forthright and honest with me about something. So what is it that you could be omitting that's making you feel the way you feel now?
I'm not admitting anything.
Okay.
Okay.
So you haven't done anything? You don't know of anybody that's done anything wrong?
No, I don't know of anyone who has done anything, and I haven't done anything.
I'm not going to find that what you're telling me, I'm not going to find that part of it's not true or all of it's not true.
No, sir. I will swear. I will swear to it.
Okay, and you
I will
don't know.
swear to it. If we had to go to court, I would swear to it.
Would you be able to take a polygraph concerning this and pass it?
I will not take a polygraph.
Did Dad die on his own, or did somebody kill him? I was just blown away, and you were angry and sad.
We would have never, ever thought that he was not safe there. He should be taken care of in the hospital, and he was murdered. I don't understand, why would someone want to kill Dad?
Why not?
Why not?
I'm asking.
Because I have a torn ACL and I have constant pain and I wouldn't pass it.
Okay. The pain would make you not pass it.
Yes, sir.
The team of investigators had identified Rita Mays as a subject and removed her from patient care.
We felt there was a lot more work to be done, not only confirming her, but also confirming that others were not at play.
Could there have been anyone else involved, or were we wrong? We had to be sure.
There were 3 other employees in the whole hospital during each of these events, or when we believe they took place. So we traced back their whereabouts, so we looked at access records. Using that, we were able to determine that they couldn't have been in Ward 3A during all of those events.
We learned that Rita Mays was the only 3A staff member that was working in and around when these hypoglycemic events occurred. We then tried to take it a step further and do a blind review for all of the glucometer readings for all staff on Ward 3A. What was alarming was Rita took a disproportionate amount of severe low blood sugar readings as compared to other staff members.
We learned that Rita Mays' husband had been in jail during the times in which the murders took place. Rita Mays' husband would call her almost every morning after her overnight shift ended.
Night. What is it? Oh, yes.
During some of these calls with her husband, Rita indicated her struggles with her interactions with these patients.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, I had to take over sitting one of the one-on-ones, and the one I was sitting with, I wanted to freaking strangle.
Why?
I couldn't keep him in bed. They had given him Haldol, and that didn't work, so they gave him 2 shots of Haldol, and he still was wound up.
When she returned the following shift after having placed that call and made those comments, the same patient suffered low blood sugars again, indicative of this patient being administered insulin 2 different occasions.
The patient, George Shaw, ultimately died from this. Mr. Raymond Golden had another nurse who was sitting with him, and Rita Mays came in and offered to give her a lunch break. And so she sat with Mr. Golden for 30 minutes while the other nurse took lunch. Following that is when he started to experience the symptoms of hypoglycemia, and then ultimately never recovered and passed away a few days later.
It confirmed and consolidated the investigative team's stance that Rita Mays was the only suspect.
Nice to meet you. My name's Carrie. Hi, Carrie.
We had a special agent from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit come out.
They offered for Special Agent Carrie Robbins to participate and to conduct the interview.
We had been prepping her for it, just one interviewer in the room.
My understanding is, did you win the Nurse of the Year award?
The year before last, Nurse's Aide.
Yeah, and I've heard that. And I've heard that you're the go-to person. You do exemplary work.
The interviewer does pay compliments to Mays that would really allow Mays to agree with her and engage her in talking. It builds a little bit of rapport, but it also makes Rita feel that she has the power in the conversation.
So the patients we're talking about, what is it that you're understanding we're all talking about?
My understanding is that they think that somebody is doing something to make these people's sugar drop, is what I understand.
Was Mr. Holloway one of the patients you were close to?
No, not really. He was kind of a grumpy old man. You know, one of them you don't really, you want to be around him, but you don't want to be around him.
Was he one of the patients that being referred to as being one of the sugar incidents?
I don't know if he was or not. I do remember that we did check his sugar that night and it wasn't low. I don't remember the exact amount it was.
You have an amazing memory.
I didn't know that.
She indicated that this patient wasn't really significant. She wasn't really close with this patient. However, she then proceeds to go into a lot of detail. That's where Special Agent Robbins cued in on.
She's looking really nervous. Something else was going on here.
Unauthorized injections of insulin proved fatal. So far, investigators say they don't know motivation for killing veterans.
Do you think something had happened to him?
I think he was done. I mean, his body gave that night, I think.
Okay.
It was his birthday and all his kids had come in, and that's one of the things that makes us, you remember certain things because they do certain things.
Have you been present when any of their patients have passed?
Yeah, I was with, we sat one-on-one and...
For this gentleman's veteran, you were there with him?
Yeah, I was. Sorry.
Oh.
Some of them, I mean, even though we had only had him that for a few hours, it was kind of scary when they do something like that.
What we saw for hours on end, it's more or less this very subtle back and forth. Rita began crying spontaneously at different points during the course of the interview. She also did not directly answer the questions that were posed to her.
It was another indicator of unusual behavior, or behavior that made no sense unless you were somehow involved in the patient's death, or if you were trying to hide something.
For whoever may have had a role involvement in this, do you think there's ever a justification for doing something?
I don't know why. It would be crazy to do something like that. That's basically taking a life. And that's not a good thing. Not at all. I'm here to listen and to want to understand you and what happened. Are you saying I did something? Is that what you're trying to say? Because I didn't do anything. Whatever you did doesn't change who you are. It doesn't. You're still that person. I didn't do anything. There's a lot of people saying you did. You don't know what happened. I told you what happened. Tell me what happened. The truth. After today, I cannot make that promise to you. That you'll be sitting across from somebody who will listen to you.
You can see she's hunched her shoulders and drawn her arms across her body as pretty defensive. So to me, I think she was panicking a little bit.
I think with what you're accusing me of, from here on out, I need a lawyer. If I stop talking to me, have a lawyer. Yep.
Right after the interview, there was a major payoff because within a few hours of that end of the second interview, she actually buys a book called I'm Dead, Now What? Indicating that she's having potentially some suicidal thoughts. Why? Because she's just been told she is the prime suspect in all of these cases.
It almost gave us more fuel to figure this out. We're going to get to the bottom of this.
Questions continue to be raised after the death of a Vietnam veteran was ruled a homicide at the VA hospital in Clarksburg.
The autopsy revealed the non-diabetic had been injected with insulin and died from hypoglycemia.
Between the second interview in August of 2018 and October of 2019, the bulk of the investigative work was complete during that time period. The investigation involved a review of hundreds of thousands of VA employee emails, years worth of internet browsing activity, a review of hundreds of hours of recorded phone calls, a review of other electronic media and electronic evidence as well.
What we learned at that point in the investigation was that Rita would talk with other staff members on Facebook Messenger, and they would, in real time, be discussing patients and what was going on the ward. And Rita was referring to some of our victims. What happened to this patient who was in this room, and what about this patient? So she was following up to see, essentially, did they live or did they die?
I appreciate it. Come on in, have a seat. You can close it or leave it open. That's completely up to you.
This occurred at the state barracks, and Rita had an appointment there to pick up some property that the state police had of hers for an unrelated reason. For the 2 weeks leading up to this interview, we had been preparing When she came into the station, Special Agent Liza Ludovico approached her and asked if she would like to sit down and hear some updates on the case.
Decide to answer questions now without a lawyer present. You do have the right to stop at any time. That's the voluntary part. Waiver of rights.
When it came time for the third interview, we wanted to let her know we have now been able to confirm that nobody else did it but you. We need some answers.
I understand what my rights are. At this time, I am willing to answer questions without a lawyer present.
If you'd like to sign, you can. If you don't want to, that's okay too.
A lot of time and effort went into preparing for this, hoping that she would confess. We were in an adjoining room with the investigative team and the prosecutors, listening and watching to the entire interview. If there was anything that needed to be followed up on, a team was ready for that.
This interview was conducted by Special Agent Liza Ludovico, a former Army nurse, currently with the FBI.
And this was the perfect interviewer. This was someone who was a registered nurse herself. She was also a veteran, and she was a trained polygrapher. So it was kind of the best recipe for an interviewer in this particular case.
About 2 weeks prior to this interview, we were working with her to start explaining the case to her, putting charts together, putting files together that would be presented to Rita.
Here is my business card, so if you ever do need to get in touch with me, as you can see, I'm not from here. I'm from Newport News, Virginia, and obviously those are my credentials.
Strategically, we placed a map of the floor with the victims laid out, and that was there to elicit an emotional response for her to look at the people she killed.
You like sports? What do you want? I'm a boxing fan. Really? I used to watch Wild World of Boxing with my dad every Sunday. CBS. Boxing and MMA.
Liza spent a lot of time in the beginning of this interview sharing information about her that she felt Rita could relate to, asking Rita about herself and her background, her family, just hours of them talking about nothing related to this case other than maybe some of her work up at the hospital, but not touching on any of these topics.
You like it when Ken Shamrock was doing television, not red. Poster. Right way. I'm not giving you everything because I'm not authorized to do that, but they wanted to make sure that I was equipped to at least show you some of the documentation. So you ready to take that for a spin? Okay. All right, so the first patient that got everything started was Mr. Posey. And this was Dr. Phillips wondering if it was divine intervention or something else that led someone to perform a finger stick that revealed the patient's low blood sugar level and advised that that person that actually did that finger stick was you. Mr. Edge, let's talk about him real quick. All right. We've got you sitting as a sitting log from midnight until 7. And you're certainly sitting in a window where he has one of these critically low blood sugar events. The investigators went and they actually have a recording of a phone conversation between you and your husband talking about this patient. You're talking about how bad your day was, and again, stress.
The one I was sitting with, I wanted to freaking strangle.
Why?
I don't think he wanted to strangle the patient. It's just showing stress.
So they're going to use me telling my husband I want to strangle somebody because I'm frustrated against me.
Here's where the issue is that you don't understand completely, I think. This is a patient that you were not taking care of. The long and short of it is it almost...
It's probably because and I talk all the time.
But it almost looks like stalking. I'm just trying to say. This is my point, Miss Rita. This is why we got to talk about this.
I'm concerned about him.
I know. This is a patient.
I mean, he could be a royal thing, but he could also be a sweetheart.
See what it looks like.
I didn't do anything to these people.
I think I can help you to explain this, but it starts with at least the acknowledgement that glucoses don't fall out of the sky.
I know they don't fall out of the sky. Okay? I did finger sticks when I was told to do finger sticks. Whether they were a diabetic or not, if I was told to do a finger stick by a nurse, I did a finger stick. That's my job.
That's not a dispute. You're missing kind of the point. There's bitter lines when you're in a room, an RN watching a patient the whole entire night. 30 minutes. You're relieving her for lunch. And in the maximum onset window after insulin's given, is bothering his stomach.
I did not give him insulin. I have never given a patient insulin. I have never injected anyone with insulin. That I will swear on my grandchild's life that I have never given anyone an injection of insulin.
Watching her swearing before her grandchild's life. And that was really indicative of a move of desperation, that the walls were closing in.
I know you're upset.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't be telling you.
I get it. Okay? I do. All I want to do is help. If you walk out of here, you know what they're going to say? What would you say if you were the prosecutor?
Because everything that you're showing me looks like I did it.
You are a brave, strong woman. But if you walk out on me, I can't help you. Please don't listen to me. Tell me what happened, please. People don't understand it. Okay? Listen. Help you. The hardest time is acknowledging you need help. That's the first thing. There's actually been videos that you've watched and articles that you've researched that suggest a very different picture than what I've been trying to talk about here.
What do you mean articles?
Forensically, they have been very busy for the last 18 months, Ms. Rita. Nurses who kill.
That was and we were talking about different forensics. Because we both like to watch forensic files.
Yeah.
Either before she was going on shift or shortly thereafter, she watched various episodes of this Nurses Who Kill docuseries on Netflix. There was one episode that detailed how essentially a healthcare provider was killing patients using insulin.
Well, like I said,
because if they look at Joanne's history, she'll have some of those in there too.
Yeah, but is not the one that's present for 9 majors, 2 of which happened on the same night. Nursing documentation that's in the room that's showing you're babysitting the patient one-on-one and blood sugars bottom out. You don't understand. How do you explain this? I don't know.
The atmosphere was tense. We were watching on the edge of our seats, sitting down the hall. Oh, she's gonna do it. This is the time. Nope, it's gonna happen.
And it hurts to say what happened to you. But it can also heal. Okay. I disagree. You have a story to tell, David.
Liza placed a Bible on the table in front of Rita just based on some of her activity with her local church. We thought that might lead her to want to talk about it, to feel bad about what she had done.
It was obviously discouraging. No direct admission or confession.
So after that third interview, the investigative team spent their time and effort on ensuring every loose end was tied up.
What we were really focused on was strengthening the medical evidence against her.
One of the strongest pieces of evidence that we obtained was from our endocrinologist. Her analysis that in all of her years doing this, she hadn't seen some of these severely low blood sugar readings. It really cemented it for us.
I approached the defense counsel and we started to talk about a potential plea resolution. She was ultimately charged by what we call an information in July of 2020. An information is different from an indictment, which is returned by a grand jury. An information is filed by the U.S. attorney. So that means you've reached an agreement without a charge, that you will file this charge and she will plead guilty to it. I think Rita Mays accepted the plea deal because she was seeing that the evidence was mounting against her. She walked in off the street, pled guilty to these murders, was put into custody, never to be released again.
Today, a former nursing assistant admitted to killing 7 veterans and attempting to kill an 8th.
Federal prosecutors say Mays gave unauthorized injections of insulin to these patients, even though most were not diabetic.
The interviews were important. Despite not obtaining a confession, there was no eyewitness, no surveillance camera footage, no murder weapon, no DNA, no fingerprint. Therefore, the culmination of the interviews strengthened the investigation.
Although we did not get the verbal answers and the confessions that we were looking for, just to be able to tap into the mindset of Rita was just as important.
Tuesday, it ended for serial killer Rita Mays with 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years for taking the lives of veterans with insulin. Mays sat in an orange jumpsuit as Judge Thomas Klee called her a monster of the worst kind. The monster that no one sees coming.
That provided some sense of closure for the family, although it never was going to bring their loved ones back.
There is that finality that not only is she behind bars, but that she herself uttered those words, that she did it to each of their loved ones.
The agents were phenomenal. They updated us constantly, and they worked feverishly on this case. They turned over every stone.
We want him to be remembered for how he lived, the type of person he was.
It's little things, you know. I missed that phone call saying, hey, come to eat supper. He made the stew and I made chili, so you miss that. I miss seeing him.
George was my life. I was 18 when I met him, and we were together for 59 years. It was just a wonderful, wonderful person. And I miss him.
"36 years later, DNA finally exposes the killer in the roadside girl case. At 2:17 in the morning, a truck driver saw something lying beside the highway and almost kept driving. It looked like a pile of clothing, a dark coat, one shoe, a pale hand disappearing beneath the weeds. He slowed down. He looked again. Then he hit the brakes. What he found on that lonely stretch of road would become one of the most haunting mysteries the county had ever known. A young woman was lying 20 feet from the asphalt. She had no identification, no purse, no telephone, no obvious connection to the area. The rain had washed away much of the evidence, and the darkness had erased whatever witnesses might have seen. But there was one thing the rain could not erase completely. Something microscopic had survived on the woman's clothing. Something investigators did not understand at the time. Something that would sit inside an evidence envelope for more than 3 decades. Her name was never known. Her family never came forward. And for 36 years, the question remained brutally simple. Who was the girl by the road? The highway was almost empty that night. It cut through a rural stretch of America, where the towns became smaller, and the streetlights disappeared altogether. During the day, the road carried commuters, delivery trucks, farm equipment, and families heading toward the interstate. At night, it became something different. Long black pavement, telephone poles, fields, trees, and miles of darkness between one human being and the next. The woman had been left near a shallow drainage ditch, partly concealed by tall grass. Her body was discovered before sunrise, but the storm had already begun changing the scene. Water ran along the roadside, mud covered footprints, tire tracks dissolved beneath puddles. The first deputies arrived expecting an accident. Within minutes, they knew it was not. She was young, probably in her early 20s, 5 feet, 4 inches tall, brown hair, a small scar near her left wrist, a faded blue sweater beneath a dark jacket. Her shoes were inexpensive. Her clothing suggested nothing unusual. There was no wedding ring, no necklace, no driver's license, nothing that could tell investigators who she was. Her face had suffered enough damage that identification through photographs would prove difficult. Fingerprints were taken. Dental records were requested. Every missing person report within the surrounding counties was checked. Nothing matched. The investigators gave her a temporary name, Jane Doe. That name would remain attached to her for decades. At the beginning, the case moved quickly. Detectives canvassed nearby businesses. They questioned truck drivers. They searched rest stops. They checked motels and hospitals. They contacted police departments in neighboring states. A composite sketch was produced and circulated. The young woman looked ordinary enough to be almost impossible to remember. That became one of the first obstacles. People could remember seeing a woman. They could remember a hitchhiker. They could remember someone walking near the highway, but nobody could confidently say that person was her. Then came the first strange detail. A motorist reported seeing a dark sedan parked near the same stretch of road earlier that evening. The vehicle had been facing away from the highway, its lights off. The witness remembered only that it was an older model, possibly black or dark green. The license plate could not be read. When detectives searched the area, they found no vehicle matching the description, no abandoned car, no broken glass, no discarded belongings, nothing. It was as if the car had never existed. Another witness came forward several days later. A waitress at a 24-hour diner said a young woman resembling Jane Doe had entered the restaurant around midnight. She had been alone. She ordered coffee but barely touched it. The waitress remembered that she kept looking through the window toward the parking lot. According to the waitress, the woman seemed frightened. But there was a problem. The waitress could not remember what happened next. She remembered the woman sitting at the counter. She remembered the coffee. She remembered the nervous glances. Then nothing. No memory of the woman leaving. No memory of who she met. No memory of whether anyone followed her. The diner had no surveillance cameras. The receipt was never found. And the waitress's description was never strong enough to establish that the woman was Jane Doe. The investigation began to slow. In those days, there were no nationwide DNA databases capable of instantly connecting an unknown victim to a family tree. There was no facial recognition, no digital trail of mobile phone towers, no social media account waiting to reveal where someone had been. Investigators had paper files, photographs, fingerprints, dental charts, witness statements, and intuition. They searched anyway. For months. Then years. The unidentified woman became a file. The file became a box. The box moved from one office to another as detectives retired, transferred, or died. The highway changed. Businesses closed. Fields became subdivisions. The diner disappeared. The old gas station was demolished. A new overpass was built less than a mile from where the body had been found. And Jane Doe remained exactly where she had always been. Unidentified. Unclaimed. Unforgotten only by the people who refused to let the case disappear. For the first few years, investigators believed identification would come from someone recognizing her photograph. That never happened. A few women were proposed as possible matches. Each one was eliminated. One had different dental records. Another was found alive in another state. A third had disappeared years after Jane Doe's death. The file filled with false leads. Then came a discovery that changed the direction of the investigation. A technician re-examining the original evidence noticed something that had been documented decades earlier, but never fully understood. A tiny stain on the inside of Jane Doe's jacket. It was almost invisible. At the time, the laboratory had attempted testing, but the technology was limited. The sample was too small. The results were inconclusive. The evidence had been returned to storage. Now, decades later, investigators wondered whether modern forensic science could do what the old laboratory could not. They sent the sample to a new facility. The first test produced a partial DNA profile. It was not enough to identify a person, but it was enough to prove something extraordinary. There was DNA on the jacket that did not belong to Jane Doe. Someone else had touched her. Someone else had left biological material behind. And that person might still be alive. For the first time in 36 years, the dead woman had a voice. It was written in 4 billion chemical letters. The investigators just had to learn how to read it. The profile was entered into available law enforcement databases. No direct match. The search returned nothing. For a moment, it looked as though the breakthrough had become another dead end. But the detectives were no longer working in 1980s America. They had tools their predecessors could never have imagined. The laboratory created a more detailed genetic profile. Instead of asking only whether the DNA matched a known suspect, investigators began looking for distant relatives. The strategy was simple in theory, but enormously complicated in practice. A person did not have to be in a criminal database for their DNA to help identify a relative. A cousin could be enough. A second cousin, a distant branch of a family tree that had never heard of Jane Doe. The search began. And then, late one evening, a computer returned a result. Not a name. Not a suspect. A family. A genetic connection so distant that it initially looked almost meaningless. But investigators followed it. They built a family tree backward. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, siblings, children, cousins. Branches spread across different states. Some families had moved west. Others had remained in the same county for generations. One branch led to a man who had been living under an ordinary name for decades. He was married. He had children. He had grandchildren. He had never been arrested for murder. He had never appeared in the Jane Doe investigation. As far as anyone knew, he had nothing to do with the case. But there was something about his family history that made investigators stop. His father had lived near the highway. His uncle had owned a vehicle matching the description of the mysterious dark sedan. And one family member had disappeared from the area around the same time Jane Doe was killed. The detectives did not arrest anyone. Not yet. They went back to the beginning. They reconstructed the victim's last known hours. They re-examined every witness statement, every photograph, every fingerprint card, every handwritten note, every scrap of paper. The waitress's story was revisited. The dark sedan was revisited. The location of the body was mapped again. And then investigators noticed something that had been overlooked for 36 years. The victim had not been killed where she was found. The evidence suggested she had been transported. That meant the killer had likely chosen the roadside as a dumping location. Not a random location. A familiar location. A place where he believed nobody would see him. The highway was no longer just a road. It was part of the killer's decision. The investigation narrowed. The man connected to the genetic family tree had lived in the area at the time. He had been 26 years old. He owned a dark sedan. He worked irregular night shifts. And according to an old employment record, he had been absent from work on the night Jane Doe disappeared. The detectives obtained a court-approved DNA sample. They compared it with the genetic material preserved from the jacket. The laboratory ran the test. The result was not released immediately. The investigators waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. Then the report arrived. The DNA did not merely suggest a connection. It excluded coincidence. The man was the biological source of the DNA found on Jane Doe's clothing. 36 years after the body had been discovered, the unknown stranger beside the road finally had a name. But the case was not over. Because the man was dead. He had died years earlier. No trial would ever take place. No jury would hear the evidence. No prosecutor would stand in a courtroom and ask for a conviction. The discovery answered one question, but it created another. Why had he killed her? And perhaps even more disturbing, who was she? Investigators now knew the identity of the person who had left his DNA on her clothing. They knew where he had lived. They knew his family. They knew his movements around the time of the killing. They knew he had connections to the highway. But they still did not know the woman's name. The investigation turned around. This time, the victim was the priority. The genetic material from her body was used to create a separate profile. Investigators compared it against missing person databases and unidentified person records. They contacted agencies in multiple states. Then genealogists began building another family tree. This one belonged to the dead woman. The process took months. And what they found was unexpected. Jane Doe had a family. Somewhere. People who had been searching without knowing exactly whom they were searching for. A genetic link eventually led investigators to a woman in another state who had submitted DNA through a genealogy service. She had never heard of the case. She had never seen the photograph. But her DNA suggested she was closely related to the unidentified victim. Investigators approached her carefully. They asked questions. She described an aunt who had disappeared in the late 1980s. A young woman. Brown hair. Quiet. Restless. Someone who had left home and never returned. The family had assumed she had started a new life. There had been no body. No confirmed sighting. No answer. For decades, the family had carried a question that never had a shape. Now it did. A photograph was shown. The woman began to cry. She recognized the face. Not immediately as the victim. As family. The woman beside the road finally had a name. She had been 22 years old. She had been reported missing. The report had been filed in another jurisdiction. A clerical error had prevented the records from being connected. Her family had waited 36 years. The killer had been dead. The victim had finally been identified. And yet the most disturbing part of the case was still hidden inside the evidence. Because the DNA on the jacket told investigators that the killer had been close to her. Very close. Close enough to leave biological material behind. Close enough to know where she was. Close enough to transport her body. But it did not explain how he met her. The diner waitress remembered the frightened woman. The dark sedan had been seen nearby. And there was one final piece of evidence that had remained almost useless for decades. A photograph taken by a passing motorist. At first glance, it showed nothing. Just a road. A gas station sign. A dark vehicle in the distance. But modern image enhancement revealed a shape standing beside the sedan. A woman. And beside her, another figure. The image was too blurred to identify either person. But the position of the figure suggested something investigators had never considered. Jane Doe may not have been abducted at the roadside. She may have entered the vehicle willingly. She may have known the killer. And if that was true, the case had never been about a stranger appearing from the darkness. It had been about someone she trusted. Someone whose name may have existed in her life long before the highway. Someone who knew exactly where to take her. Someone who believed 36 years of silence would protect him forever. He was wrong. Because evidence does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. Inside a paper envelope. Inside a locked evidence room. Inside a laboratory freezer. Inside a database. Inside the genetic code of a distant relative who never knew why a stranger's DNA mattered. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest surviving trace becomes the loudest voice in the entire investigation. The roadside was rebuilt. The ditch was gone. The grass was gone. The old diner was gone. The people who first investigated the murder were mostly gone too. But the evidence remained. And when the DNA finally spoke, it did not scream. It whispered a name. A name that had been buried for 36 years. A name that transformed an unidentified body into a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend. The killer could not be prosecuted. He could not answer questions. He could not explain why he did it. He could not reveal what happened inside that dark sedan. He could not tell investigators whether the victim fought, begged, trusted him, or realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. That part of the story remains trapped in the silence of the dead. But there is something the killer never understood. A murder does not end when the killer leaves the scene. It continues in the unanswered telephone calls, in the empty bedroom, in the photograph that stays on a mantle, in the family that keeps asking whether someone, somewhere, might know what happened. It continues in the police file that refuses to close. And it continues in the evidence locker, waiting for technology to catch up with the truth. 36 years passed. The highway changed. The town changed. The country changed. Science changed. But one thing did not change. The dead woman still deserved a name. And eventually, she got one. Not because a witness remembered. Not because a confession appeared. Not because the killer made a mistake in the final days of his life. She was identified because somewhere inside the evidence, beneath decades of dust and bureaucracy and forgotten paperwork, a microscopic piece of the past had survived. DNA had waited 36 years. And when it finally spoke, the silence was broken forever. The case should have ended there, at least on paper. The victim had a name. Her family had answers to the question that had haunted them for 36 years. The man whose DNA had been recovered from her clothing had been identified. The mystery that once seemed impossible had finally been pulled into the light. But investigators soon discovered that identifying a killer and understanding a murder were two very different things. The evidence had given them a name, but it had not given them a confession. It had given them a genetic connection, but not a motive. It had shown that the man had been close to the victim, but it could not explain what happened during those final hours. And perhaps the most unsettling question remained untouched. Why her? Why that night? Why that road? The detectives returned to the old files again. Boxes were opened. Yellowed reports were scanned. Photographs were enlarged. Names that had not been spoken in decades were written onto whiteboards. The investigation had become a reconstruction of a life that had almost vanished. They started with the victim's final week. Where had she been? Who had she spoken to? Where had she gone? Who had seen her? What had she been afraid of? The answers came slowly. She had not disappeared without warning. There had been small changes. A missed appointment. A conversation she refused to explain. A sudden decision to leave town. A friend later remembered that she had seemed nervous. Another remembered that she had mentioned meeting someone. Neither witness had thought anything of it at the time. 36 years later, those ordinary details suddenly carried enormous weight. Investigators began looking at the killer's life through the same lens. He had lived quietly. That was perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. There was no criminal legend surrounding him, no string of violent arrests, no public reputation as a dangerous man. To neighbors, he had been ordinary. He went to work. He paid bills. He attended family gatherings. He grew older. He watched people around him die, without ever knowing that he carried a secret. His family described him as private. Some called him difficult. Others said he could become angry without warning. One relative remembered that he hated being questioned about his past. Another recalled an old photograph of the dark sedan. It had disappeared years earlier. The detectives searched property records and found the vehicle had been sold shortly after the murder. The buyer had no connection to the case. The car itself was long gone. No forensic evidence remained. But the timeline was becoming clearer. The man had been near the victim. His vehicle had been near the highway. His DNA had been on her clothing, and he had never reported seeing her. That silence became important. Investigators interviewed surviving relatives again. They asked the same questions differently. Had he ever mentioned a woman who disappeared? Had he ever talked about the highway? Had he ever returned home late that night? Had he ever behaved strangely afterward? One family member remembered something. A sentence. Barely more than a sentence. Decades earlier, during a family argument, the man had allegedly said that people should stop asking about the past because some things were better left buried. At the time, nobody knew what he meant. Now the sentence sounded different. But suspicion was not proof. The detectives needed more. They went back to the original crime scene. There was no longer a field, no drainage ditch, no abandoned stretch of darkness. The highway had expanded. Streetlights had been installed. Traffic moved constantly. A modern development stood where the old roadside had once been. The investigators stood there anyway. They looked at the distance between the highway and the location where the body had been discovered. They considered how long it would take someone to stop a vehicle, move a body, and leave without being noticed. They reconstructed the weather, the visibility, the traffic. Then they realized something. The killer had taken a risk. A huge one. He had chosen a location that was isolated, but not completely isolated. Someone could have seen him. Someone almost did. The truck driver who discovered the body had arrived only hours later. If the driver had stopped earlier, the entire case might have unfolded differently. The killer had not controlled everything. He had simply been lucky. For decades. That thought changed the tone of the investigation. Because the case had not survived 36 years because the killer was a criminal mastermind. It had survived because the technology of the time had been unable to read the evidence. That distinction mattered. The truth had not been absent. It had been trapped. The DNA had been there. The witness statements had been there. The photographs had been there. The family had been there. The missing person report had been there. The information existed. It simply had not been connected. That realization led investigators to examine other unidentified victims connected to the same period. Could the man have been involved in another disappearance? Was this a single act of violence? Or had the roadside case been one episode in something larger? The answer remained uncertain. No additional DNA match was found. No second victim was definitively connected. No hidden confession emerged. But one detail continued to disturb investigators. The killer had apparently known the victim's movements. He knew where she would be. He knew the road. He knew the area. And according to one witness, the victim had not looked frightened when she entered the dark vehicle. She had looked uncertain. There was a difference. Fear suggested a stranger. Uncertainty suggested someone familiar. That possibility became the emotional center of the case. Perhaps she had believed she was getting into a car with someone who would help her. Perhaps she had believed the journey would be brief. Perhaps she trusted him. And perhaps the moment she realized she was wrong came only after the doors were closed. There was no way to know. The killer had taken that answer to the grave. The victim's family struggled with that uncertainty. Identification brought relief. But relief was not the same as closure. For decades, they had imagined countless possibilities. Maybe she had left voluntarily. Maybe she had started a new life. Maybe she had forgotten them. Maybe she was alive somewhere under another name. Those possibilities had been painful. But they were possibilities. Now there was certainty. She had not abandoned them. She had been murdered. And the person responsible had lived for decades after her death. He had celebrated birthdays. He had watched children grow. He had attended weddings. He had probably stood beside people who never knew what he had done. That reality was almost impossible for the family to process. The investigation became a lesson in the strange cruelty of time. 36 years can transform a crime scene into a shopping center, a witness into an elderly person, a suspect into a grave, a photograph into a faded piece of paper. But DNA does not care how old a photograph becomes. It does not care how many buildings rise over the old road. It does not care how many detectives retire. It does not care how many times a case is labeled cold. The biological evidence remains. And that is why the investigators kept asking one final question. What else could the DNA reveal? A second laboratory independently tested the sample. The result was consistent. The genetic profile was real. The chain of custody was intact. The evidence had not been contaminated. The connection was genuine. For the first time, investigators could publicly say what had once seemed impossible. They knew who had left the biological evidence. They knew who the victim was. They knew that the two had crossed paths. But they still could not reconstruct the final conversation. They could not hear the engine of the dark sedan. They could not see the expression on the victim's face. They could not know what the killer said. And that is where the case remains frozen. Not in the laboratory. Not in the database. Not in the evidence locker. But in one missing moment. A moment between two people. A moment that lasted perhaps minutes. A moment that ended with a young woman beside a road and a killer driving into the darkness. 36 years later, technology had finally opened the door. But behind that door was not a complete story. It was only the outline of one. And perhaps that is what makes cold cases so disturbing. People imagine that solving a murder means finding a name and closing a file. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the name is only the beginning. Because a victim is not a case number. She was a person who had favorite places, familiar voices, private fears, unfinished plans. She had a future that disappeared in a single night. For 36 years, the world knew her only as Jane Doe. Now, her family could say her real name. They could put her photograph beside the photographs of people who had loved her. They could finally explain where she had been. And they could finally stop wondering whether she had chosen to disappear. She had not. Someone had taken that choice from her. The killer could no longer be questioned. But his silence had been defeated by something he could never have predicted. A microscopic trace. A piece of biological evidence left behind without intention. A strand of the past that survived rain, time, storage, technological limitations, and human failure. The killer had believed the road would erase everything. It did not. The rain did not. The darkness did not. 36 years did not. And eventually, neither did death. Because DNA had found the one thing investigators had been searching for since the night the truck driver stopped on that empty road. A connection. A name. A truth. Not every mystery ends with a courtroom. Not every family receives the justice they imagined. Some cases end differently. They end with a laboratory report. A photograph. A family notification. A grave finally marked with the correct name. And a detective closing a box that had remained open for most of a lifetime. But somewhere beyond the evidence room, beyond the reports and photographs and genetic profiles, the old highway still exists in another form. Cars still pass through the darkness. Headlights still cut across the fields. Drivers still travel that road without knowing what happened there. Most will never notice the place. They will not know that a young woman once lay hidden in the grass. They will not know that a family waited 36 years for an answer. They will not know that a murderer once believed the night had protected him. But the road remembers in its own way. The records remember. The evidence remembers. And now, the victim has been remembered too. The case that began with an unknown girl beside a road ended with science speaking where witnesses could not. And the final message was brutally simple. You can bury a body. You can abandon a vehicle. You can destroy a photograph. You can leave town. You can grow old. You can die. But if even one microscopic trace survives, the past may still be waiting. 36 years is a long time. Long enough for a town to change. Long enough for children to become grandparents. Long enough for a murderer to believe his secret was safe. But it is not long enough to erase DNA. And it is not long enough to erase a victim. Because sometimes the dead do not need to speak. Sometimes all they need to do is leave behind one tiny piece of evidence. And eventually, someone will find it. The file was closed, but the story was not. That distinction mattered to everyone who had touched the investigation. Officially, the identification had answered the central question. The victim was no longer Jane Doe. The man connected by DNA had been identified. The evidence had survived long enough to speak. But cold cases rarely end cleanly. They leave fragments behind, questions without witnesses, motives without explanations. And sometimes, the most disturbing part is not what investigators discover, but what they realize they will never know. The victim's family received the final identification on a quiet morning. There were no cameras, no dramatic courtroom announcement, no crowd waiting outside a courthouse. Just a telephone call and a name that had been missing from their lives for 36 years. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then someone on the other end of the line began crying. The family had spent decades imagining her alive. They had imagined her walking through another city, working another job, building another life. Perhaps married. Perhaps with children. Perhaps simply choosing never to come home. Those possibilities had kept the door open. Now the door was closed. The woman had not disappeared. She had been taken. And the person responsible had carried that secret for the rest of his life. After the identification became public, investigators began receiving messages from people who believed they knew something. Some were genuine, others were speculation. A few were memories that had been buried for decades and suddenly resurfaced after seeing the news. One message came from a former truck driver. He was old now. His hand shook as he wrote. He said that on the night the body was discovered, he had seen another vehicle farther down the road. He had always believed it was irrelevant. He had never reported it because he could not remember the license plate. But he remembered the headlights. 2 white lights. Stationary. Then gone. The information could not prove anything. The driver could not identify the vehicle. He cannot say whether it belonged to the killer. But investigators documented it anyway. That was the nature of the case. Every fragment mattered. Even after the killer had been identified, detectives continued reconstructing the timeline. The victim had left home. She had traveled toward the area. She had apparently entered the diner. She had been seen near the highway. The dark sedan had been reported. Then she disappeared. Hours later, she was found dead. The killer's DNA placed him in physical contact with her. But the timeline still contained a gap. A gap measured in minutes. Perhaps hours. The investigators could never completely fill it. That gap became the final mystery. One theory suggested that the killer had known her socially. Another suggested that they had met through work. A third possibility was even more unsettling. He may have encountered her by chance. There was no evidence strong enough to prove any of these theories. The case remained defined by what could be demonstrated. And that was important, because cold cases can easily become legends. A rumor becomes a theory. A theory becomes a fact in someone's memory. And eventually, the truth becomes almost impossible to separate from the story people have created around it. Investigators refused to do that. They returned to the evidence. The DNA was real. The identification was real. The missing person report was real. The vehicle connection was documented. The rest remained uncertain. That discipline preserved the integrity of the case. It also made the mystery more haunting. Because the truth was not a complete movie. It was a collection of hard facts surrounded by darkness. The victim's family eventually held a memorial service. There was a photograph at the front. A young woman smiling. The photograph had been taken before the highway. Before the investigation. Before the evidence bags. Before the word unidentified. People who had known her as a child came forward. Some had kept letters. Some had photographs. One person brought an old piece of clothing. Another brought a birthday card that had never been thrown away. For the first time in 36 years, the woman existed publicly as herself. Not Jane Doe. Not case number 17. Not unidentified female. A person. A daughter. A sister. A memory. And that was perhaps the most important thing DNA had accomplished. It had not brought her back. Nothing could. But it had returned her identity. The investigation also became an example of how dramatically forensic science had changed. When the body was discovered, investigators could not imagine the tools that would eventually solve the case. They could not imagine genetic genealogy. They could not imagine databases containing millions of profiles. They could not imagine software capable of connecting distant relatives through fragments of shared DNA. They could not imagine investigators reconstructing family trees across generations to identify a person who had been dead for decades. At the time, DNA itself was still largely outside the practical reach of ordinary criminal investigations. 36 years later, a microscopic sample could become a map. A map leading through generations. A map leading backward through families. A map eventually leading to a name. That transformation changed the meaning of the evidence. The old laboratory had not failed because the evidence was useless. The technology had simply not caught up with it. That distinction is one of the most important lessons of every long unsolved case. Evidence does not always expire. Sometimes our ability to understand it expires first. And technology can reverse that. A fingerprint once considered too damaged can sometimes be re-examined. A photograph once considered meaningless can sometimes reveal details. A biological stain once considered insufficient can sometimes produce a genetic profile. A missing person report filed in one state can eventually connect with an unidentified body discovered in another. The past does not necessarily disappear. It becomes fragmented. The job of investigators is to reconnect those fragments. But there was one thing technology could not recover. The victim's final words. Nobody knew what she said before entering the car. Nobody knew what she thought when she realized something was wrong. Nobody knew whether she recognized the danger. Nobody knew whether she tried to escape. Nobody knew whether she believed she was safe until the final moment. The killer was gone. That conversation was gone with him. And that silence became permanent. There is a particular cruelty in that. Families can receive a name. They can receive evidence. They can receive an explanation of how a person died. But sometimes they can never receive the answer to the question that matters most. Why? Why did someone decide that another human being should not live? Why did that road become the final location? Why did the killer believe he could get away with it? And why did he keep silent for the rest of his life? The investigators found no diary, no confession, no hidden letter, no recording, no secret photograph, nothing that could reveal his inner thoughts. His death had taken the final explanation with it. But there was another detail that continued to bother the detectives. The victim's clothing showed no sign that she had expected to disappear. There was no packed bag, no preparation, no evidence that she had planned to leave permanently. Whatever happened had not been part of a long-term plan. Her disappearance had been sudden. That mattered, because it meant the final hours were probably ordinary until they were not. That is how many tragedies begin. Not with a dramatic warning. Not with thunder. Not with a villain announcing himself. Sometimes it begins with a simple decision. A person accepts a ride, walks outside, answers a telephone, enters a vehicle, takes a shortcut, trusts someone, and then the ordinary world disappears. That realization changed the way the family remember her. They stopped asking why she had been on the road. They stopped blaming themselves for not knowing. They understood that she had made an ordinary choice in an extraordinary moment. The responsibility belonged elsewhere. Years after the identification, one investigator returned to the original location alone. He had been a young officer when the case began. Now, he was retired. The road was almost unrecognizable. Traffic moved constantly. Buildings stood where fields had been. The old ditch was gone. He stood beside the road and looked across the landscape. For decades, he had carried the case in his mind. He remembered the first photograph, the evidence bag, the unanswered telephone calls, the false identifications, the family members who refused to stop asking questions. He had believed that if he lived long enough, he would see the case solved. He had. But the feeling was not triumph. It was quieter than that. He later described it as relief mixed with sadness. Because solving the case did not change what had happened. It only changed what the world knew about it. The young woman was still dead. The killer was still dead. The missing years could not be returned. But the uncertainty had finally ended. And sometimes, that is what justice looks like in a cold case. Not revenge. Not spectacle. Not a dramatic confession. Just the removal of one unbearable question. What happened to her? Now there was an answer. She had been murdered. Someone had done it. And science had preserved enough of the truth to prove it. The story spread beyond the county. Other families began contacting investigators. People whose relatives had disappeared decades earlier started asking whether old evidence could be tested again. Could that envelope in an evidence room contain DNA? Could that old garment identify someone? Could a forgotten sample connect two cases? Could a name still be found after 30, 40, even 50 years? The answer was increasingly yes. Not always. Not quickly. But sometimes. And every successful identification changed the expectations surrounding cold cases. The message was powerful. Unsolved did not always mean unsolvable. Unknown did not always mean unknowable. And forgotten did not mean gone. For the woman who had once been called Jane Doe, the breakthrough came after 36 years. For investigators, it was the end of one search and the beginning of another understanding. The smallest traces can outlive almost everything. They can outlive buildings, outlive vehicles, outlive witnesses, outlive suspects, outlive investigators. Sometimes they even outlive the people who left them behind. And that is why the old evidence envelope mattered. Inside, it was not merely a stain. It was a message from the past. A message that had waited patiently for someone to understand it. The killer believed the road would swallow the truth. It did not. The storm did not. Time did not. Death did not. The truth simply waited. 36 years. One generation. Then another. Until science finally opened the envelope and gave the silence a voice. And somewhere in a family home, a photograph that spent decades surrounded by questions could finally be placed beside a name. Her name. The name she should never have lost. The name the road could not erase. The name the killer could not bury forever. And that is the final lesson of the case. A crime can disappear from headlines. It can disappear from newspapers. It can disappear from police briefings. It can disappear from the memories of the people who once lived near the scene. But evidence has no memory problem. It simply remains. Waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for a database. Waiting for a genealogist. Waiting for one relative to submit one sample. Waiting for one investigator to open one old box. And sometimes, after 36 years of silence, that is all it takes. One box. One sample. One genetic connection. One name. And suddenly the girl beside the road is no longer unknown. She is remembered. She is identified. She is finally home. But the road remains. And when the headlights pass over the asphalt at 2 in the morning, when the fields disappear into darkness, when the world becomes quiet enough to hear the tires against the pavement, there is still something unsettling about that place. Because once, long ago, someone believed the darkness would keep a secret. It didn't. The darkness only delayed the truth. And 36 years later, DNA brought it back. The story did not become quieter after the identification. In some ways, it became louder. News reports that had once described an unidentified woman suddenly had a name. Old photographs resurfaced. Former witnesses began talking. People who had forgotten the case discovered that they had never truly forgotten the image of the young woman beside the road. And investigators learned something that often happens when a cold case is solved after decades. The answer can awaken memories that have been sleeping for years. One former employee of the roadside diner contacted detectives after seeing the new reports. She was elderly now. Her voice was weak, but her memory was remarkably precise. She remembered the night the young woman came inside. She remembered the coffee. She remembered the way the woman kept looking toward the parking lot. But this time, she remembered something else. A man had entered the diner. Only for a few seconds. He had stood near the doorway. He had not ordered anything. He had looked directly at the woman. Then he had left. The waitress had forgotten the detail because, at the time, it seemed insignificant. 36 years later, it became one of the most important pieces of the timeline. She described him. Average height. Dark hair. Work jacket. Quiet. He had not spoken to the woman inside the diner, but he had watched her. The investigators compared the description with photographs of the identified killer from that period. The resemblance was not perfect. Memory after 3 decades could not be treated as a photograph. But there was enough similarity to make the detectives take notice. Then came another witness. A retired mechanic. He had operated a small repair shop near the highway in the years before the murder. He remembered a dark sedan that came into his shop regularly. The owner was the same man. According to the mechanic, the vehicle had a mechanical problem shortly before the murder. A door latch. The rear passenger door. It had not closed properly. The mechanic remembered repairing it. That detail was significant because investigators had long suspected the victim may have been transported in the vehicle. Now there was evidence that the killer had been driving a car with a recently repaired rear door. Still, there was no direct proof. The vehicle was gone. The mechanic's records had been destroyed years earlier. The witness was relying on memory. But the pieces were beginning to align. The diner. The vehicle. The DNA. The highway. The missing woman. The investigators reconstructed the evening minute by minute. At 11:41 p.m., the victim was believed to have been near the diner. At approximately midnight, the dark sedan was seen nearby. Shortly after, the victim was no longer inside. At some point after that, the vehicle traveled toward the rural highway. Hours later, the truck driver discovered the body. The exact sequence could not be proven. But for the first time, the case had a coherent timeline. And then something happened that investigators had not expected. A family member of the killer contacted them. He wanted to speak privately. He said he had remembered a conversation from decades earlier. It had happened shortly after the murder. The killer had come home late. His clothing was wet. His vehicle was dirty. He had become angry when asked where he had been. The family member had never connected the incident to the murder. Why would he? There was no reason. The killer was simply a man who had come home late during a storm. But now the memory looked different. The family member told investigators that the killer had washed his vehicle the following morning. Not unusual, except that he had washed the inside. That detail had never appeared in the original case file. The detectives asked why. The answer was uncertain. The witness could not remember. Maybe mud. Maybe spilled liquid. Maybe nothing. The killer was no longer alive to explain it. The investigators documented the statement. Then they stopped. Because they knew the difference between evidence and possibility. The case was already solved as far as identification was concerned. They did not need to manufacture certainty where none existed. But the family member continued talking. He said the killer had behaved differently after that night. More withdrawn. More irritable. And for years afterward, he avoided the highway. He would take longer routes even when the highway was faster. At the time, nobody understood why. Now they did. Or at least, they had a theory. The old highway had become the location of his secret. A place he could not forget. A place he believed nobody would ever connect to him. But every time he drove near it, he would have remembered. The investigators wondered whether that was punishment enough. Not legally. Not morally. But psychologically. To know that a secret was buried somewhere beneath the road. To pass near it repeatedly. To watch the world continue as though nothing had happened. To know that somewhere, someone was still waiting for a daughter to come home. The killer had lived with that knowledge for 36 years. The victim's family had lived with uncertainty. The imbalance was unbearable. He had known. They had not. That was one of the cruelest aspects of the case. The person who caused the disappearance had possessed the answer, while the family was forced to live without one. But now the balance had shifted. The family knew. The killer was silent. And the evidence had become the witness. That is why the DNA mattered so much. It was not simply a technological achievement. It was a reversal of power. For 36 years, the killer had controlled the secret. Then a microscopic trace took control away from him. He had never confessed. He had never spoken. He had never pointed investigators toward the evidence. He had simply left something behind. A biological signature. An accidental fingerprint written into the fabric of the victim's clothing. He did not know he was leaving it. He could not remove it. And he could not stop it from surviving him. The investigators began using the case in training sessions. Not because it was sensational, because it demonstrated something fundamental. Old cases require patience. They require respect for evidence. And sometimes they require the willingness to reopen questions that were considered settled decades earlier. The original investigators had not been careless. They had worked with the tools available to them. They had followed leads. They had interviewed witnesses. They had searched records. They had done what they could. The breakthrough came because another generation inherited their work. That is the hidden chain behind many cold cases. One detective collects the evidence. Another preserves it. Another notices something. A laboratory develops a new technique. A genealogist sees a connection. A relative submits DNA. And suddenly, pieces separated by decades fall into place. The case becomes solvable because nobody allowed the evidence to disappear. That is why the evidence room mattered. Not because it contained dramatic objects. Most of the items were ordinary. Clothing. Paperwork. Photographs. A small evidence envelope. But ordinary objects can become extraordinary when time changes their meaning. A piece of clothing that once seemed like nothing more than a victim's jacket became the bridge between two generations. Between the investigators who first found her and the investigators who finally identified her. Between the family that had lost her and the technology that returned her name. The killer had left a trace. The victim had left a trace. And both traces survived. That realization led investigators to something else. They began examining the possibility that the victim's own DNA might help identify other relatives. It did. The family tree expanded. Branches appeared across multiple states. Some relatives had never known she existed. Others had known only fragments. The investigation eventually reconstructed parts of her family history that had been lost over time. The process was emotional. A woman who had been known for decades only as an unidentified victim suddenly had ancestors. Cousins. Family photographs. Childhood memories. Stories. She had not appeared from nowhere beside the highway. She had come from somewhere. She had belonged to people. That changed the emotional meaning of the case. For years, the victim had existed only in the language of forensic science. Female. Approximately 22. Brown hair. Height. Weight. Cause of death. Evidence. Now, those measurements were replaced by memories. Someone remembered her laugh. Someone remembered the way she used to fix her hair. Someone remembered that she disliked thunderstorms. Someone remembered the way she used to sit quietly when she was thinking. Those details were not in the police report. They were not in the DNA profile. They could not be entered into a database. But they were the things that made her human. And perhaps that was the final form of identification. Not merely knowing who she was. Remembering who she had been. The family eventually returned to the old highway. They did not go there to search. There was nothing left to find. They went there because they wanted to see the place where her life had ended. The road was busy. Cars passed. People drove without knowing why a small group stood quietly near the shoulder. There was no monument. No large sign. No dramatic marque. Only the road. The family stood together. Someone placed flowers. Another person held the old photograph. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then they left. The road continued carrying traffic. That is the strange thing about places where terrible events happen. The world does not stop. The road remains a road. People still drive to work. Trucks still pass through the night. Gas stations still open. Buildings rise. Children grow up without ever knowing what happened. History disappears beneath ordinary life. But for the people connected to the victim, that place can never be ordinary again. It becomes a coordinate in memory, a location that means something no map can explain. The final investigative report was eventually completed. It contained facts, dates, laboratory findings, witness statements, identification records, a conclusion. The murder was solved through modern DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. The suspect was identified. The victim was identified. The case was closed administratively. But one sentence remained in the investigator's private notes. It was not part of the official conclusion. It said, "She waited 36 years for someone to say her name." That sentence captured what the case had become. Not just a murder investigation. A race against forgetting. Because that is what time does. It erodes details. It removes witnesses. It destroys records. It turns buildings into memories. It turns suspects into graves. And if investigators stop looking, time can make the truth appear impossible to recover. But sometimes the evidence survives. Sometimes a cold case is not dead. It is dormant. Waiting for the right technology. Waiting for the right question. Waiting for someone to look at an old piece of evidence and ask something different. What if this can still be tested? What if that old profile can still be compared? What if the unidentified woman is not truly unidentified? What if somewhere, someone is still related to her? Those questions changed everything. And that is why the final image of the case is not the body beside the road. It is not the dark sedan. It is not the suspect's photograph. It is not even the DNA report. It is a family photograph. A young woman smiling. Alive. Recognizable. Loved. A photograph that existed long before the highway turned her into a mystery. For 36 years, the world knew only the dead woman. Now the world could remember the living one. And perhaps that is what the killer failed to understand. He believed killing her would erase her. It did not. He believed leaving her beside an empty road would make her anonymous. It did not. He believed the storm would destroy the evidence. It did not. He believed time would protect him. It did not. The road carried his secret for decades. The evidence carried it longer. And DNA carried it farther than he could ever have imagined. 36 years later, the truth finally arrived. Not with a confession. Not with a dramatic arrest. Not with a killer standing in handcuffs. It arrived quietly. Inside a laboratory report. Inside a genetic match. Inside the name of a woman who had been waiting for the world to remember her. And when that name was finally spoken, the silence of 36 years ended in a single moment. The case was no longer about an unknown girl beside a road. It was about a person who had been loved, lost, and finally found. And somewhere in the records of the investigation, beneath layers of paper and dust, the old designation was removed. Jane Doe. Unknown female. Unidentified victim. Those words disappeared. One name replaced them. Her name. The name that should have been there from the beginning. The name that survived 36 years of darkness. The name DNA finally brought home. The name was finally there, printed in black ink on the official record. For the first time in 36 years, the victim was no longer a question. But as investigators closed the file, another realization began to settle over the case. The most important evidence had been sitting there from the beginning. Nobody had known what it meant. That was the terrifying part. The truth had not suddenly appeared. It had been present all along. The jacket had existed on the night of the murder. The biological trace had been deposited before the body was found. The missing person report had been filed years ago. The family had kept photographs. Witnesses had carried memories. The dark sedan had been seen. The highway had remained exactly where it was. Nothing had been invented. The missing piece had been connection. And once the pieces were connected, 36 years of uncertainty collapsed with astonishing speed. The investigators began asking what other cold cases might contain the same kind of hidden answer. They knew there were others. Files stored in county basements. Boxes marked with dates. Evidence bags sealed before modern DNA testing existed. Unidentified remains buried under temporary names. Families who had stopped calling police because they had been told there was nothing more to do. The roadside case became a reminder that unsolved did not necessarily mean forgotten. Sometimes it meant waiting. That word began appearing in conversations among investigators. Waiting. A sample could wait. A fingerprint could wait. A photograph could wait. Even a family tree could wait. But people could not wait forever. The victim's parents had died without knowing what happened to their daughter. One sibling had spent decades wondering whether she was alive. Another relative had stopped discussing the disappearance because the pain had become too difficult. The identification came too late for some of them. That was another cruelty of cold cases. Solving the mystery does not rewind the calendar. It cannot return the people who spent their lives wondering. It cannot restore the years stolen by uncertainty. It can only stop the uncertainty from continuing. For the surviving family, that distinction mattered. They no longer had to wonder whether she had chosen to leave. They no longer had to defend her against rumors. They no longer had to imagine 1,000 possible endings. They knew. The truth was devastating. But certainty was different from uncertainty. Grief has a shape. Not knowing does not. For 36 years, the family had lived inside that shapeless space. Now there was a grave. There was a name. There was a date. There was an explanation. And there was someone responsible. Even though that person was beyond the reach of a courtroom, the evidence had established what happened. That mattered. Still, investigators remained troubled by the absence of motive. They searched the suspect's records one final time. Old employment documents, property transactions, telephone records that had survived, letters, photographs, personal notebooks, anything that might explain the relationship. Nothing provided a definitive answer. There was no confession hidden inside a drawer. No diary entry describing the crime. No photograph of the victim. No message saying where he had taken her. No explanation. The killer had left behind evidence of his presence. He had not left behind an explanation for it. And perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps he had spent 36 years refusing to think about that night. Or perhaps he had thought about it every single day. Nobody would ever know. The investigators considered whether the killer had acted impulsively. There was some evidence supporting that possibility. The victim had not apparently been targeted through an elaborate plan. The location may have been chosen because it was familiar. The vehicle may have been used because it was available. The storm may have provided an unexpected opportunity. But another theory suggested planning. The victim had been transported. The body had been placed away from the main road. The killer had apparently attempted to minimize the chance of immediate discovery. Those actions required decisions. Whether those decisions had been made minutes before the murder or hours earlier remained unknown. The distinction could never be resolved. And that uncertainty became part of the final report. Investigators refused to pretend they knew what they could not prove. There is something important about that restraint. True crime often rewards dramatic answers. People want a villain with a motive. They want a clear sequence. They want a final sentence explaining everything. Real investigations rarely provide that luxury. Sometimes the evidence tells you who. Sometimes it tells you where. Sometimes it tells you when. And sometimes it never tells you why. The roadside case became one of those mysteries. The DNA answered the central question. But the human question remained. Why did this young woman become the victim? The killer could have answered that. He never did. The family would have asked him questions. He never heard them. Investigators would have challenged his version of events. He never gave one. The courtroom would have examined his actions. There was no courtroom. His death had erased the final confrontation. But it had not erased the evidence. That difference mattered. The killer's death ended his story. It did not end the victim's. Her story continued through the people who remembered her, through the investigators who refused to forget, through the laboratory technicians who examined a decades-old sample, through the genealogists who followed distant genetic connections across generations, through the family members who finally understood that the woman they had mourned had never chosen to abandon them, and through every cold case investigator who looked at an old file and wondered whether another answer might still be waiting. The science was extraordinary, but the human persistence behind it was equally important. Someone had preserved the evidence. Someone had maintained the records. Someone had reopened the case. Someone had requested new testing. Someone had examined the result instead of dismissing it. Someone had built the family tree. Someone had made the difficult phone call. Cold cases are often solved through technology, but technology alone does not solve them. People do. People who keep looking. People who are willing to admit that an old conclusion may not be the final conclusion. People who understand that evidence can become more valuable with time. The first investigators had worked without the tools available decades later. Their work had not been wasted. It had become the foundation. Every photograph they took, every sample they preserved, every witness they interviewed, every report they wrote, all of it survived long enough for another generation to use. That is why preservation matters. A piece of evidence that seems insignificant today may become decisive tomorrow. A sample that cannot be interpreted today may become readable years later. Science moves forward. Cases can move with it. The victim's family eventually received copies of the final forensic findings. They were difficult to read. Clinical language, laboratory terminology, percentages, genetic relationships, dates. But beneath the technical language was one devastating certainty. The woman had not disappeared voluntarily. Her life had ended beside the road. And someone had been responsible. The family did not need the details repeated. They needed the truth preserved. They asked investigators to keep every remaining piece of evidence. Even after the case was administratively closed, nothing would be discarded, because the evidence had already proven what time could not. It had survived. And there was still a possibility that future technology might reveal more. Perhaps one day, another piece of evidence could answer the missing questions. Perhaps another witness would remember. Perhaps another database would reveal a connection. Perhaps the suspect's history would be reconstructed more completely. Or perhaps nothing else would ever emerge. The case might remain permanently incomplete. But incomplete was not the same as unsolved. That distinction became essential. For decades, the family had possessed no answer. Now they had one. Not every question, but the most important one. What happened to her? She was murdered. Who was responsible? A man whose DNA survived on her clothing. Who was the victim? A woman whose name had been lost for 36 years. How was the case solved? By connecting evidence that had been waiting across decades. That was enough to transform the case. Enough to restore identity. Enough to end the search. Enough to allow the family to grieve without wondering. The old highway remained unchanged in memory, even though the physical landscape had transformed. For the investigators, it became a symbol. A place where the past had tried to disappear. A place where the killer had assumed nobody would ever look again. But investigators had looked. 36 years later, they had looked again. And again. Until the smallest trace became the largest breakthrough. There is a strange power in that. A killer can destroy physical evidence. He can abandon possessions. He can move away. He can change his appearance. He can build a new life. But he cannot completely control what his body leaves behind. Cells. Blood. Skin. Hair. Biological material. Tiny pieces of himself that can remain long after he believes the danger has passed. The killer had not understood that. Almost nobody could have understood it when the crime occurred. DNA technology was not yet capable of doing what it eventually did. The future had not been invented. And that is perhaps why the case survived. The killer's greatest advantage was time. But time eventually became the investigator's greatest weapon. Every year brought better science. Every generation brought new databases. Every technological breakthrough made old evidence more valuable. What had once been a dead end became a genetic doorway. The killer had been counting on the past remaining in the past. But modern forensic science does something remarkable. It reaches backward. It takes evidence collected decades earlier and asks new questions. Questions that investigators of the past could never have asked. And sometimes the answer is waiting. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly. Inside a sample. Inside a database. Inside a distant relative's DNA. Inside an old photograph. Inside a forgotten memory. Waiting for the right connection. That was what happened here. 36 years after the woman was found beside the road, the case finally moved from mystery to history. But the history was painful. Because behind every forensic breakthrough is a human tragedy. Behind every DNA profile is a person. Behind every unidentified body is a life. Behind every cold case file is a family that once waited for a phone call. The victim's family finally received theirs. It came decades too late. But it came. And when they heard her name, the woman who had been reduced to a case number became herself again. That was the final victory. Not over the killer. Not over the darkness. Not even over death. It was a victory over anonymity. For 36 years, the world had not known who she was. Now it did. The killer had wanted the road to become the final chapter. It wasn't. The final chapter was the laboratory. The final witness was DNA. The final identification came from a family connection that crossed generations. And the final truth was simple. He had left something behind. He had left a trace. He had left a piece of himself on the victim. He could leave the highway. He could leave the town. He could leave the world. But he could not leave the evidence. The evidence stayed. And 36 years later it spoke. The evidence spoke, but it did not speak loudly. There was no dramatic confession, no final confrontación, no suspect sitting beneath a bright interrogation lamp, finally admitting what he had done. There was only a laboratory result, a family connection, and a conclusion that had taken 36 years to reach. Yet sometimes the quietest evidence is the most devastating because it leaves no room for excuses. The investigators understood that immediately. The genetic profile did not care whether the suspect had been respected in his community. It did not care whether he had raised children. It did not care whether neighbors remembered him as polite. DNA does not recognize reputation. It does not respond to character references. It simply establishes biological connection. And that connection placed him beside the victim. 36 years earlier, investigators had looked at the evidence and seen uncertainty. Now they looked again and saw a path. The path began with the jacket. It continued through the laboratory, then into a database, then through a distant relative, then across generations of a family tree. And finally, it reached a man who had been dead for years. The distance between those points was enormous, but the DNA connected them. The investigators began reconstructing the suspect's final years, not because they expected a confession from a dead man, but because they wanted to understand whether there had been signs of violence in his life. There were no obvious ones. No dramatic criminal record. No public pattern. No obvious trail of victims. That discovery created an uncomfortable question. Could a person commit one terrible act and then live an ordinary life for decades? The answer, investigators knew, was yes. Human behavior does not always fit the stories people want. Some offenders leave patterns. Others do not. Some confess. Others remain silent. Some are caught immediately. Others carry secrets until death. The suspect appeared to belong to the last category. His ordinary life had become almost the perfect disguise. He had not needed to disappear. He had simply continued living. That made the case more disturbing than a story about a fugitive. There was no chase. No hidden identity. No international search. The man had not been running from the police. He had been living among everyone else. Perhaps that was why nobody suspected him. The family members who later learned the truth struggled with that realization. They had loved someone who carried an unforgivable secret. Some wanted to believe the DNA was wrong. They asked whether contamination was possible, whether the sample had been stored correctly, whether another explanation existed. The laboratory answered every question. The sample had been preserved. The genetic profile was reliable. Independent testing confirmed the result. The family was forced to confront something they had never imagined. The man they knew had another identity. Not a different name. A hidden part of the same person. That is one of the most difficult realities in criminal investigations. People are rarely monsters every second of every day. They can be fathers, brothers, employees, neighbors, friends, and still commit terrible acts. The ordinary moments do not erase the crime. The crime does not erase the ordinary moments. Both can exist. That contradiction was painful for everyone involved. Meanwhile, the victim's family faced a different contradiction. They finally knew who had taken her life. But knowing did not bring peace immediately. The first days after identification were filled with questions. Why had she been there? Why had she trusted him? Could someone have saved her? Could the family have done something differently? Those questions were impossible to answer. Investigators repeatedly told them what the evidence showed. There was no indication that the family could have prevented the murder. There was no reason to believe they should have known. The victim had been living an ordinary life. She had not disappeared because she wanted to punish anyone. She had not abandoned her family. The family eventually understood that. But understanding did not erase grief. It only changed its shape. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. Now they lived with finality. The difference was enormous. Uncertainty says maybe. Finality says never. And yet finality can eventually allow healing. A family can mourn someone who is gone. It is much harder to mourn someone whose fate remains unknown. That was why identification mattered so much. The DNA did more than identify a killer. It gave the victim back to her family. Not physically. Not in the way they wanted. But historically. Legally. Emotionally. She existed again in the official record. Her life could be documented. Her death could be acknowledged. Her photograph could be placed beside her name. The old newspaper articles could be corrected. The missing person file could be connected to the unidentified body file. Two separate records became one story. And that connection revealed another failure of the past. The victim had been reported missing. Her body had been discovered. Yet the two systems had never successfully connected. Different jurisdictions. Different databases. Different spellings. Different procedures. One report remained on one side. One body remained on the other. For 36 years, the truth existed in two separate places. That was perhaps the most heartbreaking detail. Nobody had hidden the victim. Nobody had erased her deliberately. The system simply failed to connect the information. Technology eventually repaired what bureaucracy had left fragmented. That lesson reached beyond one case. Cold cases often survive inside gaps. A missing person report here. An unidentified body there. A witness statement in another county. A laboratory sample stored somewhere else. A relative who does not know that the person they are searching for may already have been found. The pieces exist. They simply do not know that they belong together. Modern investigative systems are designed to reduce those gaps. But no system is perfect. That is why old cases continue to matter. Because every unidentified person represents a broken connection. And sometimes one connection is enough to restore an entire life story. The victim's case also became an example of how genetic genealogy can transform investigations. Traditional DNA comparison asks a direct question. Does this profile match that known person? Genetic genealogy asks something broader. Who is this person related to? That difference changes the search completely. A direct match may not exist. But relatives exist. Families branch. Genes travel across generations. And those branches can eventually lead investigators toward a name. The process can feel almost impossible. But it is based on something simple. Families leave genetic patterns. Those patterns survive time. The victim had left one. The suspect had left another. The investigators had only needed to find the connections. Once they did, 36 years of uncertainty collapsed. The case became a reminder that forensic science is not magic. It is patient work. Testing. Verification. Comparison. elimination, documentation, rechecking, and sometimes doing the same thing twice to make sure the answer is real. The laboratory did not simply announce a name. It produced a result. The result was independently examined. The chain of custody was reviewed. The genealogy was checked. The identity was confirmed through additional evidence. Only then did investigators accept the conclusion. That caution mattered. Because after 36 years, they could not afford to be wrong. A false identification would have created another tragedy. It would have given a family the wrong answer. It would have damaged the integrity of the investigation. It would have allowed the real truth to disappear again. So the investigators moved slowly. Ironically, the case that had waited 36 years could wait a few more months for certainty. When the final confirmation arrived, there was no celebration. The investigators sat quietly. Some had worked on the case for years. Others had inherited it. One detective had not even been born when the victim was killed. That fact struck him. The victim had died before he existed. Yet he was the person who helped identify her. Generations had crossed inside one investigation. The victim belonged to one generation. The original detectives belonged to another. The new forensic team belonged to a third. The science connected them all. That is one of the strange powers of cold cases. They create conversations between people who never lived at the same time. An investigator in the future can examine the work of someone who died decades earlier. A laboratory technician can interpret a sample collected before they were born. A genealogist can identify a person through relatives who never knew the case existed. Time becomes less like a wall and more like a bridge. The victim's family eventually created a small memorial. No elaborate monument. Just a photograph and her name. The inscription was simple. It did not mention the killer. It did not describe the murder. It did not focus on the road. It focused on her life. That decision mattered. Because for 36 years, the case had been defined by how she died. Now the family wanted people to remember that she had lived. She had been more than the last night of her life. More than a body. More than DNA. More than a headline. More than a cold case. She had been a young woman with plans. The murder had taken her future. It did not have to take her identity too. That was why the final identification was so powerful. The killer had controlled the ending. He had not controlled the memory. The investigators had not allowed that. The family had not allowed it. And time had not succeeded in erasing it. 36 years later, the victim was finally visible again. Not as a mystery. As a person. And the man who had believed the darkness would protect him had become something else. A name in a forensic report. A photograph in an investigative file. A dead man connected to a crime he had carried into the grave. He could not escape the evidence. He could not rewrite it. He could not explain it. He could not destroy it. The road had kept the secret. The evidence had kept the truth. And DNA had finally opened the door between them. There was still one final unanswered question. What happened during the last hour of the victim's life? Nobody knows. That hour belongs only to the dead. Perhaps that is the part of the case that will never be solved. Not every mystery has a final witness. Not every crime has a confession. Not every question has an answer waiting inside a laboratory. Sometimes the truth arrives incomplete. But incomplete truth can still be powerful. Because it is enough to restore a name. Enough to identify a killer. Enough to end a family's search. Enough to prove that the victim was never forgotten. And perhaps that is what justice meant in this case. Not seeing the killer punished. not hearing him confess, but making sure the woman beside the road did not remain anonymous forever. 36 years passed. The evidence waited. Science advanced. The family endured. And finally, the truth surfaced. Not because the killer wanted it to, because he left behind something he could never take back. A microscopic trace. A biological signature. A piece of himself. And after 36 years, that tiny trace became louder than his silence. It became the voice of the evidence. The voice of the victim. The voice of a case that refused to disappear. And once that voice was heard, there was no going back. The unknown woman had a name. The unknown killer had an identity. The family had an answer. And the road, once silent, had finally surrendered its secret. The road had surrendered its secret. But secrets rarely disappear all at once. Even after the victim had been identified and the man responsible had been named, investigators continued to find fragments buried beneath decades of silence. The case had become something larger than a murder investigation. It had become a reconstruction of a life, a reconstruction of a night, and a reconstruction of the failures that allowed two separate identities to remain disconnected for 36 years. The first question was simple. How had nobody recognized her? The answer was more complicated than anyone expected. She had been young. She had moved between places. She had not carried identification when her body was found. Her family had reported her missing, but the report contained information that was incomplete. A middle name had been entered incorrectly. One detail about her age was slightly wrong. The description had been written by someone who had not seen her for several months. Small errors. Individually meaningless. Together, devastating. The unidentified victim file contained another description. Brown hair. Approximately 22. 5 feet, 4 inches. A scar near the wrist. The two records were close, but not close enough for the systems of the time to connect them. There was no universal database. No automated search. No algorithm comparing every missing person against every unidentified body. There were people. People typing names. People reading reports. People comparing photographs. And people make mistakes. One detective reviewing the old documents noticed something that had escaped attention for decades. The victim's dental information had been requested from another jurisdiction. The request had been sent. The response had never arrived. Nobody knew why. The detective searched old correspondence. There was the original request. There was a notation indicating that records were being sought. Then nothing. A missing page. Perhaps the records had been delayed. Perhaps the wrong office had received them. Perhaps someone had filed the response incorrectly. Whatever happened, the opportunity disappeared. A single piece of dental information might have identified the woman years earlier. It never did. That discovery was painful, because it showed how close the answer had been. The case had not been completely invisible. The answer had been within reach. It had simply slipped through a bureaucratic crack. The investigators began looking for other missed opportunities. They discovered that a witness had mentioned a woman matching the victim's description at the diner. That statement had been recorded, but the witness had described the woman as possibly older. That uncertainty caused investigators to classify the sighting as low priority. Another witness remembered a dark sedan. The description had been too vague. Another recalled seeing someone near the roadside. The time was uncertain. Each piece was weak. Together, they became significant. That was the nature of the case. No single clue had been enough. The truth existed as a mosaic. For decades, investigators had been staring at individual pieces. Modern analysis allowed them to see the picture. The DNA was the most important piece, but it was not the only one. The genetic evidence identified the killer. The genealogy identified the victim. The witnesses reconstructed movement. The vehicle records established opportunity. The old reports established chronology. And the physical evidence connected the people. It was not one miracle. It was hundreds of small facts finally pointing in the same direction. That realization changed how the detectives viewed the original investigation. They did not consider the first investigators failures. They considered them pioneers working in an era without the necessary tools. In the early years, investigators had done what they could. They photographed the body. They collected clothing. They took fingerprints. They searched the surrounding area. They interviewed witnesses. They preserved biological material. They stored the evidence. That last decision became the most important of all. Because if the evidence had been destroyed, the future would have had nothing to work with. The old investigators could not know what DNA technology would eventually become. They simply followed procedure. And decades later, that procedure saved the case. This is the part of cold case investigations that rarely appears in headlines. The glamorous version is the breakthrough. The DNA match. The name. The shocking revelation. But behind that moment are years of preservation. Evidence must survive. Records must survive. Files must survive. Sometimes investigators themselves must survive long enough to remember why something mattered. The roadside case had been lucky in that respect. The evidence had survived. The people who cared had survived. And eventually, the technology arrived. But the investigation still had one disturbing problem. The killer had not been a stranger in the conventional sense. His DNA suggested physical contact. The witness timeline suggested familiarity. The vehicle placed him near the victim. And the victim had apparently entered his vehicle without immediately raising an alarm. That raised a possibility that investigators could never fully prove. She may have known him. Perhaps they had met before. Perhaps she trusted him. Perhaps he had offered her a ride. Perhaps she believed he was taking her somewhere safe. If that was true, then the murder had begun with trust. That possibility changed the emotional weight of the case. A stranger attacking a victim is terrifying. Someone trusted by the victim is something else. It forces people to reconsider ordinary interactions. A ride. A conversation. A familiar face. A person who seems safe. The danger may not announce itself. It may look ordinary. That was one reason the victim's family struggled with the story. They wanted to know whether she had known the killer. They wanted to know what he had said. They wanted to know whether she had recognized the danger. They wanted to know whether she had been afraid. Investigators could not answer. The evidence stopped at the boundary of the final moments. There were no cameras. No recording. No surviving witness. No confession. The last hour remained sealed. And perhaps it always would. The family eventually stopped asking investigators for details they could not provide. Instead, they asked something different. Could they see the evidence? Could they understand how the identification had happened? The investigators explained the DNA process. They showed how a partial profile could be developed, how distant relatives could reveal genetic connections, how family trees could be constructed, how the suspect was eventually identified. The family listened. For them, the science was almost impossible to understand. But they understood the result. A tiny piece of evidence had crossed 36 years to find them. That was enough. One relative later said that it felt as if the victim had left a message. Not intentionally, not consciously, but somehow, a part of her had survived long enough to bring the truth home. The investigators understood the sentiment. In forensic science, biological evidence is often described clinically. Cells, profiles, alleles, matches, probabilities. But behind every sample is a human story. The sample from the jacket belonged to a murder victim. The DNA from the suspect belonged to the person who had touched her. Those were scientific facts. But together, they told a human story. A violent encounter. A life ending. A secret beginning. 36 years of silence. Then discovery. The case also changed the way the community remembered the highway. For decades, locals had told stories about the road. Some said it was dangerous. Some believed other disappearances might be connected. Some claimed they had seen strange vehicles. Most of those stories had never been substantiated. Investigators warned the public not to confuse rumor with evidence. That warning was necessary. Once a cold case becomes famous, stories multiply. People remember things differently. Details become exaggerated. A shadow becomes a person. A car becomes a specific model. A rumor becomes a confession. A possibility becomes a certainty. The investigation had to resist that. Only documented evidence mattered. The DNA mattered. The verified family connection mattered. The witness statements mattered where they could be corroborated. Everything else remained speculation. That distinction protected the victim's memory. She deserved the truth, not mythology. The killer deserved no invented crimes. And the investigation deserved accuracy. The final report therefore contained a strange combination of certainty and uncertainty. Certainty about identity. Uncertainty about motive. Certainty about biological contact. Uncertainty about the exact sequence of events. Certainty that the victim had not voluntarily disappeared. Uncertainty about her final conversation. Certainty that the killer had been identified. Uncertainty about what he believed would happen after the murder. This was not an unsatisfying conclusion. It was an honest one. Real life does not always provide perfect endings. Sometimes justice arrives carrying unanswered questions. But even partial truth can change everything. Before the DNA breakthrough, the family had nothing. Afterward, they had a name. Before the breakthrough, the killer was unknown. Afterward, he was identified. Before the breakthrough, the death was surrounded by uncertainty. Afterward, investigators could establish responsibility. That was enough to transform 36 years of darkness. The case also demonstrated something more uncomfortable. Technology can solve mysteries, but technology cannot guarantee justice arrives in time. The victim had already been dead for 3 decades. The killer had already died. The courtroom could never hear the evidence. No sentence would be imposed. No jury would deliberate. The legal system could not deliver the ending that people associate with a solved murder. But the truth still mattered. Because justice is not only punishment. Sometimes justice is recognition. Recognition that a person existed. Recognition that a family was telling the truth. Recognition that a disappearance was not abandonment. Recognition that a murder had occurred. Recognition that someone was responsible. The victim's name now existed where the words unknown female had once appeared. That mattered. Her family could finally visit a grave. They could finally tell future generations what had happened. They could finally stop saying, "We don't know." That sentence had controlled their lives for 36 years. Now it was gone. There were still questions. There would always be questions. But the biggest one had been answered. And perhaps the most haunting detail was that the answer had been waiting in silence the entire time. The evidence had not aged in the way people had. The DNA had not forgotten. The jacket had not forgotten. The records had not forgotten. Only the world had forgotten how to connect them. Then one generation of investigators looked again. They asked a different question. They used a newer technology. They followed a distant genetic connection. And the entire story changed. The girl beside the road was no longer a mystery. The man who believed he had escaped history was no longer invisible. The family no longer had to search. 36 years had passed. But the truth had not. It had simply been waiting. Waiting inside the evidence. Waiting inside the records. Waiting inside the bloodline. Waiting for science to become capable of hearing what the past had been trying to say. And when the answer finally came, it was not complicated. It was not poetic. It was not dramatic. It was simply a name. Her name. A name that had survived every mistake, every delay, every dead end, every year, every winter, every summer, every generation that passed without an answer. A name that proved the victim had never truly disappeared. She had been hidden by circumstance, but she had never been erased. And that is why the final image of the investigation is not the empty highway. It is not the evidence locker. It is not the suspect's photograph. It is a file being reopened after 36 years. A detective turning a page. A laboratory technician examining a sample. A genealogist following a distant branch of a family tree. A telephone ringing in a house where nobody expected that call anymore. And a voice on the other end finally saying the words that one family had waited decades to hear. We know what happened. For 36 years, those words had been impossible. Then DNA made them real.